Welcome back to Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life with Laurel and Laurel. Welcome, Laurel. How are you today?
I'm well today. How are you?
I'm doing very well after having a couple weeks of a headache. I feel like $1,000,000 today not having a headache.
I'm so glad you're feeling yourself again.
I know I am too. So today, listeners, we are continuing our topic of loving kindness, loving self-kindness. And we're going to give you maybe a big lesson, or it could feel like a big lesson. So grab a journal, grab a piece of paper or your pad or whatever, and get ready to take some notes because this is going to be a really juicy, juicy one. And I love this topic. It's one of my favorite topics. I've been talking about this topic for so long, Laurel. I can't
How
wait to
long?
share today.
Years,
Years
right?
and years and years. Yeah. So if you go back, let's see. I might reissue those videos because I don't think they're live on YouTube right now, but I probably will go reissue them when we get to this, when we're releasing the podcast. And it's all about putting your anger to good use. And our topic today is transforming anger into loving kindness. And to me, that seems like a pretty big ask.
Absolutely. It really does. And I want to know,
Mm,
when you're angry, who is it that you need to bring the loving kindness to?
yes. So first self,
I
and
That's what I was thinking.
then others. Yes. Right.
Whenever I feel angry,
Yeah.
I really do need to forgive myself and treat myself with loving kindness because it's not a it's not an emotion, it's not a feeling that I'm used to.
Yeah. Or generally comfortable with. I know most of us aren't
That's right.
comfortable with it. It takes
Yeah.
it takes some good practice. And I feel like some kind of reconditioning your mindset around anger to really do this one well. And practice, a lot
Yes.
of practice. I feel like I do it pretty well most of the time, but it's still hard sometimes when depending on what the circumstances are. It's not always easy to get quickly from anger to loving kindness. But it's certainly possible, and it's definitely worth it because, wow, like you free yourself from so much energy that can be so burdensome over time if you can't work this process well. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And I know I'm often critical of myself when I experience anger, right?
Yeah.
That just letting anger get the best of me brings out my inner critic.
Yeah, it can. It can. And
Yes.
and so so the first lesson would be, right, being aware if you don't like how you feel or respond to your anger, that's the beginning of taking ownership and knowing that you can do better. And the question is,
Yes.
how do you do better? And we're going to give you that right now.
Yes. And I want to remind our listeners, we're not talking about not letting yourself feel anger
Oh,
because
absolutely not.
feeling all of your feelings is very important, and learning to be more comfortable with the uncomfortable emotions is really important for our own inner work and self-growth. So just
Yeah.
a reminder.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Because going right into this, like the beginning is allowing yourself to feel the anger and acknowledge it fully, right? So that would be lesson number one, right? As we go
Yes,
through,
it
it's
would
almost like
be.
this was like a 5-part series that I did. And the first part was really just allowing yourself to feel the anger and become comfortable knowing what anger feels like in you and how you experience it, right? And so sometimes I know for me, my anger, I had kind of sublimated it and at some level transferred it more to sadness, right? Because
Yeah.
I couldn't hit my anger directly. I didn't have a space to do it. I was afraid of it. There were a lot of reasons that I did what I did. So if you're used to knowing, wow, I get angry, but then when I get angry, I cry and I get upset. Sometimes that's kind of mixed up in there, right, with all of this. So the beginning is just noticing and being able to get to the point where you can say, wow, I feel really angry right now. And then also knowing like there's a range of anger. I always think of anger as being a range from very mild irritation to rage, right? And straight up anger is somewhere like in the middle, right? And
Yes.
so the intensity, really intense, feeling out of control anger is rage. And then this really mild kind of irritation, like, sometimes I think of, the classic leaving the top off the toothpaste tube, as being one of the, every time you look at it, you get a little miffed, right? And so that's kind of the mild irritation. But if you aren't expressing it and you aren't doing anything about it, it becomes a cumulative anger that starts to, feel out of control if it reaches a certain point, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
then becoming familiar with the body signals of anger. What does it feel like physically in your body when you're angry? Does it, feel like a tightness in your chest, or you feel like you get heat in your face? Everybody has their own signals of what that feels like, and becoming really accustomed to that, because that helps you identify it and being able to name it just for
yes.
what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Anger is a great emotion to use, the kind of the tool that I learned in the neuroscience of change, with where do you feel it in your body, right? Are you aware enough of your physical being to know where anger causes your body to respond, right? Is it the tightness in your chest? Is it in your throat, right? I don't know where it may show up, but where does it show up? And then, if what color is it, is one of the questions that we use often to kind of describe. I mean, when anger shows up for me, it's always shows up in a bright, like a fiery color, right?
Mm.
And then what shape would it be if you could name a shape?
Mm.
And when we start to think about the characteristics of it, right? And
Yeah.
often this exercise is really, really good when we can't put a name on an emotion. So maybe you are irritated, and I hate to say it, I never really would have thought about irritation being anger, but it is,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And when you said it really well, a mild form of anger,
Yeah.
but maybe you start there when it's irritation,
Yeah.
right? Doing the question of what color is it, what shape is it, and starting to feel into what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love the color and the shape, because that kind of hits, I think, for some people, they're visual. People that are really visual often have images or colors or whatever that allow them to really self-express. And so when you learn that as part of your intelligence system, you can kind of you can use that as an identifier
Right.
of your emotions. So for some people that are auditory, it might come in a certain kind of voice.
Yep.
It might come in I always think of the mental component, which is sometimes when we get angry, we start running a story, right? Or some lines, some repetitive lines, like, so if we use the classic tube off the toothpaste, oh my God, I can't believe she did that again. She's such a slob. She doesn't care what I want, whatever, right? You run the story, and the story's repetitive, and usually it's the same thing, and it helps you get fired up, and it makes your anger, usually more intense. But unless you're expressing it to the person and asking for what you want, it doesn't do anything. It just leaves the anger there for you to stew in. Yeah.
Yes. And
Yeah.
that is not a good place
No,
to keep your anger.
that's right. That's right. So identifying our anger. So that's the beginning, right? Knowing that you're angry, owning it, I'm really angry right now. And then going into what I kind of think of as the anger and values phase. So this is kind of my lesson number 2, which is whenever we're feeling angry, something that we value, something that we care about, some high priority in our life usually is being violated. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's some violation either by yourself or by another person or by both, right? So oftentimes, if you're stuck in loops of not using your anger well, you are also in a loop usually of violating your own values, right? You might be, becoming really obnoxious to be around, because now you sound like, somebody that nobody would ever want to be interacting with, right? Like you start to take on behaviors that you don't feel good about. So now you're violating your own value system. And this is part of the complexity of what anger can look like when we don't know how to do it well, right?
Right. And
So,
that is
yeah,
really the place where kindness comes in, right? Loving kindness, right?
right.
I was thinking as you were speaking about the example of, I value honest I'll say, uh, good conversation, right? Good communication.
Yeah.
And often when anger shows up, it's nearly impossible to communicate well, right?
Yeah.
And so then, like, I am then violating my own value of good communication.
Exactly. Exactly. And that idea of being respectful, I was thinking about like in my example, if you start running off at the mouth and maybe insulting somebody or saying really nasty things to somebody, you begin to feel like you're disrespecting other people. So if respect is a high value for you, right, you're violating that
Yes.
value for yourself. So just becoming clear, like, I know if I'm really angry about something is, okay, can I identify what value of mine, what do I care about here that I feel like is being violated, right? Or something is happening that is infringing on that value so that I'm not feeling good about the whole situation, right? Or the other person. And
Right.
then being able to be clear about that and give voice to it. So you might want to write on that part of it, like really when you sit down and start writing, like, wow, I feel really disrespected when they do that because I've talked about this over and over again and da 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 da. And then being able to like be prepared to talk about that in really clear words, but in a way that where you're communicating well, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the issues with anger. Oftentimes we don't communicate at a time when we can get our message across clearly because the anger gets in the way of that. So sometimes we need to process the feeling of the anger a little bit and then go into the communication phase of it. So sometimes there needs to be a little bit of a gap there, and that really just depends on the person how you have to work that out. Yeah.
Yeah. And even that takes good communication and
Yeah.
respect, right?
Right.
Telling
Right.
someone that you need time and
Yes.
you'll talk about this later, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Which
Yeah.
leads us right into what I consider lesson number 3, which is anger and boundaries. And I know with my clients, I've said this for years and years and years with all my clients. Like when you think about anger, I want you to have a B word. So it's AB. Anger is A, and then B is boundaries. So if you can follow your anger with the right boundaries, your anger will dissipate. It will automatically be relieved of itself from your beingness in a really healthy way. But the
Can you
tricky
give
part
us,
is,
go ahead,
yeah.
keep
So the
going.
tricky part, right, is the boundaries, working out the boundary part. So, just we'll just use the classic tube off the toothpaste because it's really simple and we don't have time to get into really complex equations, but it applies the same in all of it if you can just nut it down into its simplicity state. Okay. So the tube's never on, the toothpaste top is never there. It's never on. There's gunk all over the counter. You look at it every time, you clean it up, you don't. And what do you want your boundaries to be? So you start thinking about like, okay, what do you want? So the first thing you ask yourself is, what do you want? Okay, what you want is the other person to always put the tube on the toothpaste and make sure there's not a glob of toothpaste on the counter, right? Okay, that's what I want. So those are my boundaries that I'm working towards, right? So you want to keep in mind that that's your end goal, right? If those boundaries were to happen, you'd never get angry anymore about that. That issue would be over.
That's right. You could get angry about something else.
That's right. So hopefully not, but probably we'd work on to something else if had control issues like I do. Okay. So we go to, yeah, what do we do? Right. So now we have to communicate this well, and we have to come up with hopefully an agreement around that. So that's the goal. That's the end game is how can I get an agreement with whoever this is that's not doing it to agree to condition themselves to actually just simply put that top on, take a minute and look down and make sure you didn't leave a glob on the counter, right? And that's really all about communication.
And so let's talk about boundaries in that example for a minute, though.
Yeah.
So you would be setting the boundary that you aren't going to tolerate the cap off the toothpaste or toothpaste on the counter,
Yes.
and then you communicate
Yes.
your expectation, and voice it as a boundary,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know in boundaries, we set boundaries, but we cannot make anyone
Yes.
live up to our boundaries or conform to our boundaries. And so then what happens in this process with dealing with anger after you've set the boundary if a person chooses not to meet you at your boundary, not
Yeah.
to honor your boundary?
Yeah, so this one's tricky, obviously, because you have to take in all the dynamics. I know for me, if it were in my space, right, and I was feeling that strongly about it, and the other person couldn't get to that point where they could actually, I don't know, remember to just put the top on, which seems, I mean, we're using this as a simple example because
Yes.
it's kind of simple to just put the top on the toothpaste.
Yes.
Anybody that can't do that, it's kind of like,
Well, this is
huh,
why I'm asking the question, Laurel, because
yeah,
this is a simple example,
I know.
but the process of establishing your boundary, communicating your boundary, that happens with every, whatever it is that's causing us irritation, going back to our anger, a situation
Yeah.
requires the same process of knowing your values, knowing what value is being violated, knowing your boundaries or setting boundaries, communicating those boundaries. And then, it is that piece of then how do we not become angry, double angry, angry over the toothpaste cap, angry over that person is not respecting my boundaries.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that comes down to the actual communication and negotiation process, right? Is
Yes.
if it's so important for that person to have to leave that toothpaste cap off, and it's really important for you to have it on, what can you negotiate around that? Like, okay, you don't mind taking out the trash. If you'll just take out the trash every single day, then I'll put the top. Like you have to come up with something that feels like it's a give and take, right?
And this is
Yeah.
you know the separate bathroom,
Yes. Yeah. And I would go there as fast as I could if I
right?
could. That would
Right,
be my choice.
it might be, be a double sink in the bathroom and you
Mhm.
ignore one
Yeah.
and you each have one, right? And
Yeah.
I mean this is of course, as we're saying, a very simple example,
And also
but
very individual depending on what your
yes,
circumstances are. How are you
yes,
going to work it out? Yeah.
yes. But I
Yeah.
think going back to the anger piece, right? We are the ones who, we know our values, we communicate our values, we set boundaries, we communicate our boundaries. If we still are angry, now we have a second source of the anger. We really need to look at, that whole process of what's being violated and what do I want to do so that I'm not angry about this situation,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
hard.
It can be hard. It can be really hard. And I think that, you're back to who are you living with? Do you share the same value system, right? So one of the hardest things is when don't share the same value system over a certain, one certain
Yes.
facet or whatever of life. Like, how are you going to work that issue so that it's not a contentious issue all the time? Like, how do you have rules of
Yes.
engagement so that it doesn't become a relationship destroyer, shall we say?
Right. And
Yeah.
I do think that, anger is really, it's a strong emotion that is a telltale sign of maybe something is not in alignment, right?
Yeah.
It might be, it might show up as anger. It might show up as snarkiness, irritation, resentful, or resentment, right? And when those type of, what I think are all, various forms of
Passive.
anger,
They're all
right?
passive anger. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
When they show up, take note, bring some awareness, use them as a clue
Yeah.
so that where can you live a life that is more in alignment with your own values and your boundaries?
Yeah.
Um, and how can you not be angry at the other person for, I'll say, allowing, if we truly allow other people to live their values and live their boundaries,
Yeah.
then we have to really think about, how can I let someone else live their values and boundaries and the way that I expect to live mine, and be
Right.
angry that that person's values and boundaries aren't in alignment with mine, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this is the complex
Yeah.
equation, right? As
Yeah.
we come into, because as you work out these details and you start to look at this all really directly, right? So for some people, the cap on the toothpaste might be an issue of disrespect versus an issue of cleanliness, or it could be an
That's
issue
right.
of cleanliness and not about disrespect. And so the language and the communication hopefully gets to the part where you're really talking about the value itself and the different ways that it might feel like it's being violated. And that's why you're really angry.
Yes. And I'm
Right?
so glad you brought that up because
Yeah.
often, you know, um, you do have to get to the core value that's being violated and know that the moment that you're angry about it, again, a simple example of the cap on the toothpaste, you know, that's only one of the ways that the violation of the value shows up. And where else does it show up? So that it's really not about the toothpaste.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you felt respected in all areas of your life and it only was putting the toothpaste cap on the toothpaste, you might do it gladly for all you know. You just
Right?
don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we want to get to that part where, for me, that's like lesson 4, right? Where anger and truth telling. You
Yes.
want to get to the point where you're at your real truth around whatever the issue is, right? And if it's a simple thing like you just, you're really, really care about the cleanliness and orderliness of your house, and you're living with somebody who just doesn't care about that at all, you are going to have to figure out how you're going to live together. That is a big issue. That is no small thing, right? And
I
how can you lighten up?
absolutely.
Can they straighten up? Like it's going to be tricky, but you have to talk about it openly and directly. More openly and directly, you talk about it with loving kindness, with compassion for one another about you know, our own little idiosyncrasies, right? Because I
Yes.
always laugh about my control issues because I think that just like it's an idiosyncrasy. Look, I like a neat house. I can't help it. You know what I mean? I'm not embarrassed about it anymore. I'm not ashamed of it. It just is what it is, right? It's what I like. It makes me feel good. I like the way it feels. So I'm an energetic person. I can tip, when things are cluttered, it feels cluttered, right? I can feel it. So it's okay to be who you are, but you got to learn how to dialogue about it in an honest and compassionate and kind way.
Yes, you do.
Yeah. And that's where the trickiness is, right? Because anger is a forceful emotion. If you're in the throes of anger, we often don't communicate with compassion and kindness. That's not generally how it comes out, right? And so to get really good at this topic, the transformational work of transforming anger into loving kindness, you have to do your own beautiful work in order to do this really well. Right. So this is like definitely season 3 work, deepening your beautiful work.
That's
Yeah.
right. Not for beginners.
Not for the beginners necessarily. Although, you take the steps. So like the beginning, I know for me, when I started working with my anger, because anger was a real issue for me, like I had really stuffed so much of my anger over my lifetime, was just learning how to get in touch with my anger and acknowledging it for what it was. That in itself was a big hurdle,
Yes. Yes. And, I think that is so true for many people that, because anger is an uncomfortable emotion and it's not accepted by most people. When we see someone else angry, that's uncomfortable as well. We don't know how to handle that. And when we're angry ourselves, we don't often accept that. So accepting it as an emotion that you are capable of feeling and understanding that it's okay. It's part of your humanness and how how you can be angry and do other things well with that anger.
Yeah. Yeah. And knowing that it takes practice, like
Yes.
giving yourself really some good grace around that, right? And we're going to talk about that in our next episode. So
Yes.
don't miss that, you know, is the idea of really knowing it's a process. If you know that, anger has not been your friend in the past and you don't know, you haven't handled things well or whatever, know that you can get good at it. It does just take practice. And first time out, it doesn't always look great, but after a few practice rounds, you get better and better. You really do. Yeah.
Right. And deciding that that stuffing your anger is not a
Yeah.
healthy,
It's
healthy
not.
practice, right? That it's a behavior that you have to unlearn,
Yeah.
right? Over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always feel like I did so much harm to my body by stuffing my anger. Sometimes I wonder how much my thyroid condition was part of that, not allowing the words to come up and out of my throat and that energy to get shoved back into my body all the time. And
Mm,
I think I mentioned this on another episode, but when I first was training as a Tai Chi instructor, and I was at the front of the class leading while another instructor was kind of talking, and I was demonstrating. I was the person in the front demonstrating, and we were doing some movement, and it was almost like I could feel like something happening in my legs energetically. I didn't really know what it was, but oh my God, I thought I was going to burst out crying and I didn't know if I could hold it back. And it was all I could do to make it to the end of that class. And when I got out to my car, I burst out crying. And I felt like I had this aha moment, when I was in my car, when I realized, wow, that's where I'd been putting my anger all those years, like
wow.
my sadness, my anger had been stuffed down and stuffed down and stuffed down. And, some of the energy started moving again and got unblocked. And, the emotion just came rushing up and out. And so, as we go through this process and we allow ourselves to feel our feelings and acknowledge them and get in touch with all of that, sometimes you can have really big, forceful, emotional, shall we say, healing sessions. I'll call it a
Right.
healing session.
Or a shift, right?
That's
And
right.
I think, often we think about anger working itself out, right? Coming out of your body
Yeah.
as a verbal, maybe exacerbation, right? Is it
Yeah.
like it
Yeah.
could just be big and loud and a little bit sharp. But let's talk for a minute about what, if our listeners, if you know that you stuff that emotion and you are carrying some anger in your
Yeah.
body, are there practices, energetic practices that we can mention for our listeners to learn what to do to shift that emotion out of their body?
Yeah, yeah. I know acupuncture helped me a lot. Tai Chi was definitely one to get your energy, because this is all about getting your energy moving and flowing through your
Yes.
body and
Yes.
unblocking those places where it has gotten blocked up and intensified. So that tapping is really great for that
That's
as
right.
well.
Right. I feel like
Yeah,
those are really three very good
yeah,
examples of what our listeners could look for and do.
yeah, absolutely,
And
absolutely.
what I love about that is that it's all, I tend to process things verbally. And so when I'm holding onto an emotion, it's an emotion that I've chosen to stuff and not verbalize, right?
Mhm.
And so I love the energetic practices because it can help you start to shift that energy in your body, open things up in a way that isn't, I'm going to say it's not scary, because you're there with an expert, someone that is trained in those practices. Or even tapping when we tap, individually, and you have a practice of tapping, it is not frightening, but
Right.
it can move the energy.
Absolutely. Really
Yeah.
powerfully. Yeah, really powerfully. The other thing I want to mention in this is we talk about moving energy differently, right? And restoring kind of a healthy balance internally, or the ability to dialogue better, right? When we're working with our anger, is coming back to when I was talking about, the story that you run through your mind, right? As you begin to notice your anger, particularly on repetitive situations, where you're really frustrated and irritated because this thing happens over and over and over again, which is often the case for many of us as we begin to really look at the patterns, right? Is to notice the mental story that's running through your mind. And what you want to do is, instead of staying in a place where the story is about blaming someone else, or you feeling like a victim, like somebody's doing something to you. The story that you want to begin to empower yourself with is a story that will sound something like, I am really angry about this thing in my life, and then name specifically what that thing is. I feel like I am being violated in the way of I'm being disrespected, or I feel like I can't use my voice and I want to use my voice. Like, get really specific and clear in that value work. And then take it to the next place, which is the really important place, is say to yourself, what I really want to have happen here is this, and name it. Name what you want to have happen so that you can start getting clear on what you're working towards and what it is that you want to communicate, right?
Yeah.
Because if you have an old story running through your mind again and again, that loop is going around and around and around. It's so easy to default to that. And then again, you sound like, somebody that can't, that the other person can't necessarily work with, right? That
Right.
there's no story there where everybody's going to win. And your story, people can come out of it in a way that everybody could win if you worked it out well, right?
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, just getting clear in those issues that we hit along the way with those little lessons. Yeah, it's really
That's great.
important.
That's great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anything else? I want to be mindful of our time.
Oh,
We need
I
to
know.
talk
I
about
do.
this.
We do need to wrap up. I
Mm.
feel like, again, coming back to, I think the final, one of the final real lessons is doing the forgiveness work that follows up with any anger, whether it's a small little thing like I forgive myself for being so unpleasant in that situation, the way I spoke to somebody. I forgive the other person for not recognizing I needed something. And, like really allowing yourself to do that forgiveness work. And for things that are repeated, long standing boundary violations for you, sometimes that can be, take a while to do the real
Yes.
deep
Yeah.
forgiveness work. And I want to say about forgiveness work is if you don't have an agreement that's working, you just keep you're in the violation loop. And so forgiveness doesn't really work because
That's right.
you're just back to now you're angry again and so the forgiveness is kind of, I don't know, it doesn't really do a whole lot until the boundaries have changed. People have an agreement, you're working on it, and now you can start to soften and know that things are changing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I do think that, self-forgiveness, right? Even if you haven't been able to change the situation, right? That it's in this reoccurring loop of the same behaviors that you're angry about. Forgiving yourself for learning slowly, right? Or being a slow learner, or forgiving yourself for not even knowing how to change the situation. I mean, I always think giving yourself grace, even if you can't change the bigger thing, that it's really important in order to keep trying, in order to keep communicating, in order to really, I'll say, keep unearthing what the value is that's being violated. Sometimes just the process of knowing takes time.
Amen, Laurel. I totally agree with that. I feel like, that knowing part is such a big deal. And then because it takes so much practice along the way to refine this to the point where you really feel like, well, I'm not angry anymore. And I did that really well with loving kindness, like like we said at the beginning, it's a big ask. But to
Yes.
get there feels really
Really.
empowering
Yes.
and really good.
It does when you're on the other side of it, right?
Yeah, so
Yes.
good.
Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So, Laurel, would you like to announce to our listeners about our retreat coming up?
Announce sounds pretty big.
I know. Well,
I
we're
would
going to
love to
start sharing
talk for a
tidbits
second about our
that. I
retreat
know.
that we are planning the Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life retreat in April 2024. Springtime, new beginnings. We'll come together for 2 nights, for a weekend, a Friday to a Sunday in New England. And we will do some inner work together. We'll share meals together, which is just be in circle with each other and really work through some of the things that we've been talking about on the podcast for
Mm.
2.5 seasons,
I know, I know.
three
It's going to be
seasons. Yeah.
absolutely wonderful. Yeah. So we're going to share more about the exact dates and where you can register and the topic that we're going to be focusing in on and some more details of the weekend in the weeks ahead. We're looking
Yes.
forward to that.
I will
Yeah.
be counting the months until April to be
Me
with
too.
all of you in person.
I know. I can't wait. I can't wait
Yeah.
to meet some new listeners and friends out there, that have been with us for a while on the journey and we haven't been able to connect directly. It'll be so beautiful to be together.
Yes, it will.
All right.
All
Off we
right.
go. Bye for now, everybody.
Bye.